Hey, look, the show's starting. Here we go. We're going to end David Thorpe yelling at me for not remembering movies like he does.
Yeah, Untouchables.
Bring it in. True Hoops from Quarantine Show. And it's big day today. Adena Jones is going to be doing a little something for us. And then Dr. Carl Suddler is here you're in Atlanta? Is that where you are?
Yeah, at Emory.
Yeah. Author of Presumed Criminal. Anyway, we'll get into that. Good morning, everyone. Adena, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I was telling you guys earlier that I can't believe it's only been a week. It feels like it's been 257 days since I've been here. So I'm happy to see you guys. Today, sorry, excuse any noise. I kind of got as a special correspondent, just kind of a mishmash of things that are going on. Because I don't want to forget about what is happening in our world and how NBA players are handling it. But there's also still what's happening in the NBA with being at Disney World and things of that sort. So let me get started with sharing the screen. And Carl, the way this goes, all right. So yeah, I saw this photo and that's Kendrick Lamar. And then we got DeMar DeRozan. They were present at a protest in Compton, which is, if for those who don't know, is DeMar DeRozan's hometown. Russell Westbrook, I believe they were at City Hall there. So there's Russell Westbrook at the protest, them leading the protest there. And I just thought, once again, I think it's last time I was here, we talked about this image of the Black man and this bandana around their necks and how it's the quintessential I'm dangerous image and where they're from and where they're at, but wanting people to realize to stop judging books by its cover. These men are millionaires, they're fathers, they're philanthropists, they're really great guys. And it warmed my heart to see them go back there. And also at the same time, we're talking about this defund the police thing, and Compton is actually a town where they defunded their police department, and in a controversial manner, and some of it went to the sheriff's department, but it just kind of all tied itself back together. So I thought that was great. And then in the protests, we had the Compton Cowboys. Not sure if you guys are familiar with them. I thought it was a great juxtaposition. I've seen Black folks on horses during these protests.
In Houston, there was a big thing, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And people, commenting on social media, oh my God, he stole the police horse and this and that. And I was like, look at your unconscious bias showing right now. I was like, why can't that be their horse? And it is their horse, right? The Compton Cowboys, they are a group of about 10 to 20 Black men who they kind of went to this fresh air fun thing as children to get away from the crime and gangs in Compton. And they taught them how to be equestrians. And they have, use this to develop relationships among themselves, but also teach people in Compton. And what's interesting, they talked about how in Compton, if they're walking to the store, they're likely to get stopped by police. But if they're on a horse, it's nah, I'm not gonna get stopped by the police. Or if I'm in a car, people think it's rival gangs and they automatically want to go head to head. But if I'm on a horse, it's just, I'm on a horse, right? So thought it was interesting how
you say that it's totally normal.
I'm actually I went to school at USC. Obviously, I said that many times, and I've seen people on horses, and I'm oh, that dude's just on a horse, They're just on a horse, and that's what they do. And I thought this was the best image that came up next. The LA Times did a story, and they're just at the drive-through, their horses, and you'll notice some of them they ride bareback because they don't have funding for all the tools that they need to ride horses. And the horses are expensive, but they get their horses for about $200 on in auctions, because a lot of times their horses are malnourished or abused. And it seems like they're saving the horses, but the horses are also saving them. So I went down a deep hole, as if I got to horses here, but it's all connected to hoops at the end of the day.
Oh, we need to stay exactly on target. You know how we are here.
This is true. We're always on target. Next up, I thought this was a pretty inspirational image. So Isaiah Briscoe, former G League player, he's from Newark, New Jersey, very close to Camden, where we talked about earlier that they defunded their police department. And he just bought a bodega in his neighborhood. He owns a bodega. And here he is in front of the bodega with the keys. And it was an inspirational image to see in the midst of all of the nonsense that's going on. And I also think about my hood, where I can go back to Bushwick, Brooklyn right now, and everything has changed in gentrification, but the one thing that's still there is a bodega. and probably the same family owns it. And I'm sure Carl grew up in the Bronx and he can relate too, right?
Yeah. Chopped cheese.
Yes. So that was a great image at this point in time. All right, so now we get to what's happening in the NBA with we're going to Disney World, right? Am I the first person to say that?
Yes. Of course.
NBA is going to Disney, and we had some people making jokes about it. I don't know if you guys watched the Disney Channel. I remember growing up, and they always had these like little commercials in between. It was like, "Hi, I'm Hannah Montana, and you're watching the Disney Channel." And so I hope they do these during NBA games. You know, "Hi, I'm Kemba Walker, and you're watching the Disney Channel." That's cute. And we did one also for LeBron, because why not? Interesting imagery I found. So people are starting to connect NBA and Disney, and I'm just wondering all the content that's going to come out of it at that point in time, especially as a social person. And I'm kind of wondering how Disney's going to capitalize off of this, because they have to. Why wouldn't they? I want to say he's an Australian designer. He designed NBA logos using Disney characters. Thought it was kind of cute. So we got Timon and Pumbaa as Chicago Bulls. The Timberwolves is the Lion King hyena. Let me go back real quick to that one. I'd buy a shirt. I'd cop. Then the Memphis Grizzlies is Winnie the Pooh.
Wow.
And obviously you got to give Mickey some love as the Boston Celtics. So this could be a new line of merch. Let's get it.
People would buy this, right?
Let's do it. Also, Disney said the NBA players aren't allowed to like go on rides. Like Disney won't be open. So people were making jokes about them sneaking onto rides. So here's a video that probably came out a while ago, but we took it to what it is. It's a Giannis on a Disney ride. I know you can see he's on this ride called Test Track.
All knees.
So I can't imagine seeing these 7-foot players trying to sneak on Disney rides. And then lastly, I thought this was the funniest thing to come out of the Disney announcement. Robin Lopez is really, really serious about his Disney World. And like the agent was announced, he's like, "You're going to Disney World." He's like, but you can't ride the rides. He's like, "Wait a minute. I have an annual pass and it doesn't have blackout dates." Like, I'm a customer. I really feel like I could see Robin Lopez on the phone with Disney customer service. Like,
yeah.
You know,
His brother has a home in Disney World.
get out. How is that even possible?
Yeah, Brooke has a home somewhere in there. I don't know exactly where, but I have players that have stayed there because I've asked them, "Where are you staying at Disney? What hotel?" Like, "No, I'm staying at Brooke's house." I'm like, "Well, we're in Orlando." They said, "No, at Disney World. He lives there." Yeah, it's crazy.
So he's probably got
Am I the only one who's a little weirded out by the adults who are Disney obsessed? Like, is it a little weird to you or no?
I see Robin Lopez as a child kind of still sometimes, but yes, it is a little weird, especially that one woman who's like, "I had a Mickey themed wedding and I got married in a castle." Like, calm down, you know.
I've seen grown women of multiple generations bawling at the parade in the afternoon because they were there with their mom or grandma or both, and they remember being there as kids, and so now they're there with their kids. So I've witnessed that, like, really emotional stuff. I think some people, it goes back to like the best memory of their childhood.
It's a big deal. It's deep in there.
It really is.
Yeah,
that's why
it is.
Disney depends on it, because they sell a lot of merchandise.
Yeah.
I just thought they were weird. But yeah, that's it.
See Judy.
She said she loves Disney. I'm sorry, Judy, you're not weird. So yeah, horses, NBA players, Disney, the usual. Thanks for listening, guys.
Thank you, Adena.
No problem.
I know you're gonna hang out this time because Carl's here.
Yes, I want to hear it.
Okay, Carl, I'm gonna read a little bit about you. So you, when you joined Emory, I'm quoting you on you. A scholar of African American history whose research interests lie at the intersections of youth, race, and crime. I'm committed to developing better understandings of the consequences of inequity in the United States. My research and teaching interests are related to 20th century U.S. history, African American urban history, histories of crime and punishment, the carceral state, that's a word I don't even know what it means, sport history and histories of childhood and youth. My first book, Presumed Criminal, Black Youth in the Justice System in Postwar New York, points to a critical shift in the carceral term between the 1930s and 1960s, when state responses to juvenile delinquency increasingly criminalized Black youth and tethered their lives to a justice system that became less rehabilitative and more punitive. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, no, thank you guys for having me.
So you've been studying for decades to become...
Okay. Yeah, the short definition of carceral is of or belonging to prisons, right? So when we think about kind of the expansion of the state, you know, obviously all things related to the legal system and the justice system, but also thinking about the welfare, the growth of the welfare state, how that ultimately can impact lives and how people end up, you know, in the legal system because of this, right? So thinking about kind of the long hands and the extended hands of the state, right, that can ultimately lead to people's lives being ones that are lived inside of prisons, right? So just for
you also teach the history of sports, and those things kind of intertwine. Do you want to start there? Can you tell us about that a little bit?
Yeah, no, so it's funny. So when I was writing this first book, I really kind of dug into, you know, again, thinking about kind of expansion of the state, and because I write about young people, crime prevention becomes a huge part of the book. And when we think about crime prevention, for a lot of folks, we think about organized sports, right? And we think about, you know, YMCAs, and we think about police athletic leagues, and we think about how these types of organizations are designed to keep young people occupied, right? Because the worst thing that you can have is an idle kid, right? Idle kids get in trouble. So the theory goes, right? And so
idle mind is the devil's workshop.
That's right. That's right. And so some of this, you know, I believe does have value, right? But it's actually going to be at the center of the next book, right? Because what I'm more interested in now is trying to uncover how the state expanded its surveillance powers through these types of organizations.
Whoa.
Right. And understanding, like, you know, the benefits of the police athletic leagues, but also the drawbacks, right? What does it mean to have increased interaction with police? Because we know police encounters are often kind of the first step for young people ending up in the system, right? So whether they're playing basketball with these kids or whether they're, you know, just getting to know them and their families, right? They start developing ideas about the potential delinquency that these kids may have, right? And that in and of itself is problematic.
Tell me more about that. Like, how does that go?
Well, so, I mean, so we see a shift early. So police athletic leagues have been around really since the early parts of the 1900s. And we see a shift in their use and really their growth. And so what we see is, like, initially it's just their organized programs have plainclothes police officers come participate in sports with kids, hopefully to kind of, you know, fix any kind of divide that there may be between the community and the police force. But then as we see it kind of grow, what we see is, you know, their want to know more about these kids. So then they start having to submit forms about what their families do, right? What their parents are doing, right? And then, you know, so then all of this becomes like data set, right? And so when we think about kind of the collection of data, especially, I mean, not to get too involved in like periods, right? But in the progressive era, we get this like massive boom of kind of data collection, right? To try to understand, to try to get ahead of problems. And so as ideas about who commits crimes are formulating, we're then developing all these kind of data sets about these kids that are involved in these programs, right? And so if the logic is low income or, you know, kids that have, you know, are coming from poor schools or low income neighborhoods and have problems at home, now the police get this information firsthand from the kids themselves, right? And from the parents. And so we see kind of a, you know, a capitalization of the state to try to get ahead of the crime problem by labeling these kids literally potential delinquents. And
what a terrible title to give a kid. Oh my God.
Yeah, right. And so, and something I talk about in the first book is that, you know, the New York Police Department, so the first book's mostly about New York City, and the New York Police Department institutes what's called the Juvenile Aid Bureau. And once they institute this program, 90% of the cases in the Juvenile Aid Bureau are labeled as potential delinquents, right? So that we see a growth in the number of kids that are interacting with the police force directly. And then people use those numbers to talk about the crime problems we're having, right? Because now it shows that there's a rise in crime because there are more kids involved, even if the kids actually haven't committed a crime at all.
We just got a sneak preview of your next book.
It sounds like organized espionage.
It's, you know, there's some problems with the, you know, state surveillance powers, right? And how the state is able to kind of manipulate data for its own benefits, right? Because then they use that same data to call for more money. They use that same data to, you know, call for more jobs, right? And we just constantly see an expansion of police power through state-run organizations.
It's it seems like any solution where everyone's gonna like will be built on increasing trust, right? Yeah. And this just seems like, well, if you're gonna spy, then you're just gonna undermine trust, right? It's just not gonna work the way you want it to work long term, it seems to me.
Yeah, no, I remember so just a quick aside, I remember having a conversation when I was writing about the police athletic leagues for the first book with my dad's a military guy, right? And so, you know, I'm at dinner table, my sister, mom, my dad, and I'm like, yeah, I'm really digging into the police athletic leagues now. My dad's like, man, I love the police athletic leagues, right? What they do for the kids and blah, blah, blah.
Uh-oh.
And my sister's like, that's where all the drug dealers go play basketball, right? Oh. And I was like, you're both right? Like you're neither of you are actually wrong, right? Like there's elements of the police athletic league that on paper are phenomenal, right? If you talk to a lot of NBA players, if you talk to basketball players on AAU circuits, a lot of them will talk about, you know, having played in PAL leagues at some point in their lives.
My son's played it, and I've coached it. Yeah,
there you go.
And
a lot of my players have played it. Yeah,
and so, you know, it's always interesting to kind of like hear the perception of it. But the flip side is you also have these guys that, you know, understand. I also get access into communities, right, in different ways through these organizations, right? And so, yes, there are quote unquote drug dealers that can, you know, be involved in these programs, right? And so when I told her, you know, like my dad's like, no, because the cops, you know, lock it down. And I'm just like, exactly.
Your dad's got a lot of faith.
He does.
Yeah.
He does. Yeah. You know, military life, police life, that'll, you know.
Yeah. Chain of command.
That's right.
Yeah.
So should I be suspect if the police in my community, because we do this, an annual game where we get kids from an area of Clearwater that's very low income, or let's just call it low income, and the police that work in that community, they play an annual game. I talked about this last week, and I speak and the mayor speaks, and it's really kind of a fun thing. I bring some of my pro guys over and they play a little bit. Should I not do that anymore?
I think you should, right? For the reasons that I think the original intentions are still there, right? I just think, you know, it's important to understand, again, how the data collected from these things are ultimately come back to bite us in the butt at times, right? Like, you know, and you know, and I think this is true for YMCAs, right? I just finished writing an article about when Jackie Robinson and Roy Campanella got hired at the Harlem YMCA in the 40s, right? They were able to boost their enrollment to become arguably the biggest YMCA in the country. And a lot of it was driven out of kids are just showing up because Jackie Robinson and Roy Campanella are there, right? But there are also elements of state powers behind YMCAs that are so invested in, you know, getting kids thinking the right way or making sure they're walking the straight and narrow. And we can see a corruption of kind of those ideas because of how we understand what the right way is or how we understand what the straight and narrow is. And that, you know, we have to be clear that that means different things for different people and not bring in kind of, you know, preconceived notions of what we should be thinking that these kids need to be doing. You know, if they're coming from single parent households, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that they're on the path to a criminal career, right? If they're, you know, instead thinking about, you know, how to fill the voids or how to fill any voids or assist any voids that can really help them, you know, for their long haul, right?
I'm like jumping ahead a lot in my head here, but do you remember when Carmelo Anthony said oh, it was like an ESPN the Magazine story by Tom Friend when he played for the Nuggets. Not Tom Friend, but when Carmelo Anthony played for the Nuggets. And he was asked about appearing in that Stop Snitching video, right? And apologies if this is just wildly far afield, but and I remember him saying like, look, like for real, like where I grew up, like when I grew up there, like the police like dragged us around and chased us and yelled at us and, you know, beating my friends, and drug dealers like bought us nice sneakers and put lights on the court so we could play. And he's like, that's why I'm in that video. And I remember just thinking like, I feel like we're just starting to unpack that now, right? Like we're just starting to understand a little bit. But oh wow, was it Tom Ferry? I take it back, a Tom Ferry article.
It's a Tom F.
I think you're right.
Yeah,
these are sort of treading in the same mistrust kind of zone.
Yeah, well, and I also think a lot about. I think what LeBron James produced the show, Survivor's Remorse, right?
Yeah.
Like when we understand kind of the difference between an NBA star and somebody who ends up, you know, living a life, you know, be it with the underground economy, right, for lack of a better word, right? The opportunities are, you know, minuscule, right? Like there's just such a small gap between how one goes one way and one goes the other, right? There's you know, one decision or lack thereof a decision. There's one thing that can happen that can literally throw it off. You know, so for me, I think it's important to use these programs not to necessarily increase the ideas that, hey, kids, you can become a professional player if you participate in these things, but actually just increase their knowledge about other avenues as well, right? You know, so the problem, and Jackie, and most pro athletes get this, right? You know, I talk about it in that Jackie and Campy article. Kids are showing up because they want to be the next Jackie Robinson, even though Jackie Robinson is telling them, you're probably not going to be the next Jackie Robinson, but I'm glad you're here. Right. So pro athletes understand that, right? They understand that everybody's not going to make it to the pros. But the problem is, you know, these organizations use the pro athletes to reel in the kids in massive numbers. And they use that kind of misguide, right? That, you know, if you do this, you might be able to come to next Jackie Robinson, when the likelihood is you also got a better chance to get struck by lightning.
Carl, let me ask you something. You talked about PAL leagues and everything, and it's very clear that most people have no idea what you said. I certainly didn't, and I've been involved in it a long time. I know that when Bill Clinton was championing the idea of hiring 100,000 police officers many times, I didn't like Bill Clinton very much, but that didn't really have resonance with me, good or bad. I think in retrospect, many of us would agree it was not a good thing, right? What else are we missing, not just white America, but certainly white America, that is happening in our landscape today that we should be worried about, that most of us aren't getting, but someone like you is paying attention to?
That any kind of reform efforts that are making police power grow, be it invisibly, you know, in terms of thinking about its surveillance powers and, you know, what we don't see, or be it visibly and just thinking about let's get more police on the force, are reforms that we should be second guessing, right? You know, when we look, and I think that's why so many calls for defunding the police are picking up some momentum right now, right? That, you know, people are looking at these police budgets and realize that cities and towns are, you know, dealing with limited resources, right? Or, you know, they're not restricted resources. And so any kind of growth that we see in these police forces is taking money from elsewhere, right? And so I think, you know, people jump at, we can't defund the police because we know, you know, they need these protections, right? But they're not the same people that are yelling and griping that we've been defunding education for decades, right? And actually, the more money that comes out of education is actually why so many police forces can be, you know, boosted, right? And so any kind of reforms that include, you know, a growth of a police state, be it invisibly or visibly, need to be second guessed, right? About why. We have enough police, right? There are enough, like I live in a I live right on the border of Decatur and Avondale, and I think the Avondale Police Department has like 30 cop cars, and it might be like a 4 square mile town, right? And so often, like, you just drive out, and there are just cops kind of just waiting for, you know, people to speed by, and, you know, and you're just like, of course you're waiting to speed by, right? There are 30 of you guys out right now, and there's nothing, you know, there's nothing for you to do. But then the flip side is, in moments like these where, you know, we look at, oh, we need the police out in full force, then people are like, this is why we have it. But the truth of the matter is these moments are so few and far between that the over allocation of budgets, the excess funds that go in there can be utilized in much better ways, right? So when LA County, you know, and the mayor comes out and says, you know, we're going to pull 100 or 150 million from the police force, people, you know, lose their shit. So, sorry, can I say?
Go for it. Oh yeah, let it rip.
All right.
For sure.
You know, people, you know, get really upset, and and
no, they lose their shit is what they do.
That's right.
They get fucking mad.
But for, you know, when we think of the police budget as something that's, you know, multi-billion dollars a year versus an education budget that you can put $150 million into, that's a lot of money that can go into education, right? And that's not a lot of money that's being pulled from the police in relation. And so, you know, it's important for us to understand that, you know, reforms that include expanding the police force, whether visibly or invisibly, need to be kind of questioned and challenged, and really kind of asking why, right? Why do we need to do it?
Well, they are making one little frustration in this conversation we've had on the show is like, you know, the answers are very hard to come by, but nevertheless, Congress is drafting them now, right? So like, you know, we're going, however crappy they may be, their votes are happening soon, right? So what should be in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to see, you know, these calls for how to divest and defund from the policing. You know, I think a lot about the work that Minneapolis has been doing. The school board voted to sever its ties with the Minneapolis Police Department, right? If you all of a sudden take away the money that you're paying for police officers to be in your schools, all of a sudden you have some extra money to go back into your schools, right? To then really think about this service and the purpose of education. Beyond that, you saw the University of Minnesota, right? Based on student protests and student organizers, the University of Minnesota's president comes out and says, you know, we're going to sever some ties with even using the Minneapolis PD at our sporting events, right? That's huge, right? Because that's a big part of the budget that can then be reallocated into the school system. You know, and I think I just had a conversation with I did an interview with the Association for Medical Colleges. And I think, you know, us seeing this moment where we're fighting police brutality and a global pandemic has been, you know, eye-opening for so many people, right? The conversation about PPE, and we see police officers in what seems like endless abundance kind of riot gear, be it filling the Jackie Robinson Stadium at UCLA, and it's just like, oh, go get what you need. And then we have doctors wearing trash bags in hospitals, right? Like, and we have to understand that these are two sides of the same coin, right? Because this money is kind of coming from same pots. And so, you know, we need to realize that the more money we put into one, that we're taking it from others. And so a defunding call isn't necessarily tied to, it's not a zero-sum game, right? It's not, oh, we need 0 police officers, we need no money, right? It's just that the police, you know, get so much money that there are ways to take money from it to reallocate it in these other places so that we don't have to think of the police or prisons as sort of solutions to these problems.
That sounds so European.
Carl, do you have an agent try to book you on nighttime talk shows? Because you need one if you don't.
No,
he was just on CNN.
Yeah, I just did my first CNN segment, which was pretty fun and nerve-wracking, but it was a good time, and it's been well received. You know, the number of hate mail. This was the first time that I've publicly, you know, spoken about these kinds of things on such a platform where the hate mail was outnumbered by the love mail, right? Oh. Like, you know, and that was nice. So I will say the hate mail started much faster. Like the first piece of hate mail came in 49 seconds after the segment.
They're right on it. They are right on it.
Listen, try picking the Cavaliers to lose to some team when LeBron played there. I don't even know what good mail looks like anymore when back in those days.
Um,
hilarious. That's like, Carl, you mentioned with the police officers just sitting around in Avondale, and I was talking to my dad, who's also a former police sergeant, and he was telling me, they're just riding around at 3 a.m. they're bored, they're typing in license plate numbers hoping to get a hit. And he actually said when he was on the force, he would be leery of calling in for backup, because these guys are bored. All they want to do is like turn on their siren, and so you call in backup, all they hear is my brother needs help, and they come in, siren, guns drawn, don't care that it's just like a regular traffic stop or someone had a tail light out. And then we get this over policing, we get resistance because they're bored. There's too many of them.
My first encounter with the Avondale police here was because I had out-of-state tags, right? And ultimately, I think, the same police officer was at the same spot, and I'm driving to work daily, and I hadn't replaced my tags, right? And so, the police officer pulls me over, and it's just like, basically, hey, you seem to drive this route regularly. However, you still have Delaware license plates on your car. This was the conversation with the police officer, right? And it was just like, and what pissed me off that day was I was going to give a guest lecture on campus, right? So it wasn't even at my normal time of driving this, right? So this idea of you drive this route regularly, I'm actually at a time where I don't drive it regularly. But it's neither here nor there, right? But then, so I will say, right, it was a long conversation that ended up in a $200 ticket. But again, we have to always be wary of these kind of initial police encounters, right? It was a police officer who I'm sitting here talking with, and if at any moment, she felt nervous or scared, or if I was like, look, lady, I really got to get to this guest lecture. Can we speed things up? And I get aggressive of any kind, like it's an out-of-state tag. Yes, like I thought about pulling the, look, I'm here taking care of my sick mother. Right. And let's see how you feel about that. Right. For stopping me now. But no, Honest Abe was like, yes, I work here. I've lived here since July. All right. And they're like, tickets. Right. Wow. But again, you're exactly right. Right. Like, I mean, the idea was, she stopped me because I had an out-of-state tag. Right. And, when we think of what can go wrong in police stops, that seems to be one of the smallest things that people get stopped for that lead to their encounter with the police force. And we know how so many of those can become deadly for whatever reason.
They have very serious security when you get on an international flight in London, right? But they talk to you a lot, right? You feel like you're having a warm and friendly conversation, but they're eliciting a lot of info. Where I was like, our security here is so like the bigger scanner, right? Like nobody, I was like, you guys haven't learned anything from me, right? Like, you don't know who's acting weird or nervous. It's more just like, take your socks, take your shoes off, put your belt over there. Like, it feels like so mechanical in every meaning of that word, right? Whereas I just feel like, my sister flew on El Al years ago, and they like just walk over and they like have like a 15-minute little interview where they like get a sense of you. And I guess what I'm saying is, even if you wanted to just do nothing but police the living hell out of people, it still feels like this car-based, tag-based, like, this isn't like the way you get real security anywhere, right? Like, it's just what they can easily observe, right? Okay,
it's a removal of needing talent. There's
yeah.
Anyone can do it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It doesn't take talent to take quarters at the toll booth either.
Right.
And I think something that's often missed out of the defunding and divestment conversation is that actually allows police forces to be more selective about who becomes police officers. Right. Because if you have an abundance of money, sure, hire everybody who's willing to come in and work. Right. If you're limited on how much money you can put out in terms of, thinking of potential pension offers, of thinking of, salaries, then you become much more selective, right, about who you're giving these benefits to, which can also be for the better good, right? Like, the screening process has to improve on who becomes police officers with defunding efforts, and not the other way around. Because when the resources are abundant, sure, anybody who comes in, right? And typically what we see, and I talk about this in the book, is that after a war and veterans from wars come back, so many of them are welcomed to the police force with
Right.
open arms.
Right.
You know, and that's always been a trend in the United
Right.
States. And, you know, and so we see this conflation of the military and police force as if they're one and the same. And you know, and sports are guilty of kind of playing into that rhetoric, right? When we are honoring our heroes, right? It's never just about the military, right? Especially post 9/11. And, you know, folks like Howard Bryan and stuff talk about this regularly, that post 9/11, you know, the police become, because they were first responders in New York City, they become kind of conflated with the military in a way that's like, oh, when we're honoring heroes, we're also honoring this, as if it's part, you know, one and the same. And it's not. It's never been.
Carl,
There's
before
a-
you, Carl, before
sorry,
you
go
came
ahead.
on, oh, go ahead. No, Henry, please go ahead.
So I sent you some stuff about Dr. Rashawn Ray's work, and of course you went to college with him. Like, such a
Graduate
small world.
school, yeah.
I'm gonna quickly read some of those notes. So, like, Chicago budgeted $650 million for. No, sorry, not budgeted. Has spent $650 million on police misconduct cases over the last couple of decades, and according to him, actually budgets for police misconduct. So he's proposing that this is a potential avenue. So basically, if they hire an officer who's a high risk to do something that would cost them a lot of money, like kill someone, then the police force feels no impact, because when this terrible thing happens, taxpayers foot the bill. Whereas if there were department-wide insurance, then it would work like a hospital, where the bad surgeon ends up, you know, being on thin ice, maybe can lose his certification, etc., by malperforming. Well, let me stop there. You're nodding, but I know that you're. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, no, that's exactly right, right. And I do think one of the reforms that Rashawn talks a lot about is, you know, reallocation of civilian payouts in these kind of instances, right? If the money is actually going to be negatively impacting the police force, then people will less likely commit these things. Or, you know, other police will hold their own police officers more accountable, right? If this is going to hurt their pockets. But truth of the matter is that very rarely has it ever hurt their pockets.
Right.
For the reasons that Rashawn lay out, right? That they actually budget for these things to happen. And, you know, I think, you know, part of the problem is, you know, with somebody like Derek Chauvin is, in thinking of George Floyd, he had, you know, according to a lot of the reports, he had something like 18 misconducts. You know,
I read 22.
Yeah,
I read 22
yeah, like,
this morning.
and so, you know, so the idea that he was still on the street at all at that point is just, you know, nonsensical, right? And if the police chief is in a position where, you know, I'm going to set something and just take, and under, you know, we can't underestimate the power of police unions, right? The police unions protect police officers the way that workers and unions have always protected workers, right? And thinking about workers' rights. The problem is how we define police as workers, and, you know, how we can then hold them accountable for these types of mishaps, right? Because, you know, if we think about a teacher in a police union or a teachers union, right? And the purpose of teachers unions is to make sure that teachers can, you know, gainfully stay employed, et cetera. You know, very rarely do we hear about the teachers unions using its political leverage to get a teacher back on the teaching force after they've, you know, done something extreme, right? But we see that time and time again. I think, you know, the Florida police, there was like Brevard County Police Union, like, tweeted out to officers that were being let go in Buffalo, to officers that were being let go in Minneapolis, like, you know, you have a home here, basically. And you it's illogical to so many people, right? Like, people hear that and it's just like, this is crazy. As
When
if
the guy
happened time and time again, you know.
The guy who killed Tamir Rice, who was, I think, a 12-year-old with a toy gun, then had previously resigned his job because he was found unfit to be an officer, right? Then kills, then gets another job. And then somebody caught on to this. This is what I talk about in a national database, right? But like, these like documented cases of police misconduct are now, I guess, only 16 states reliably report the information. And there's one of the things that is in a bill proposed right now is a database of the whole country. So you can at least find out if you're hiring one of those officers at a minimum.
Yeah. But I mean, you know, I think the Brevard County example is
it's not going to work.
Right. Well, they not only know that they're doing it, they're actively you know, serving a purpose to quote unquote keep these guys, you know, employed. And I mean, it's just, you know, it's perverse.
Carl, we used to talk a lot about basketball when Henry and I would be on the phone over the years, and we talked a lot about building culture. It's a big part of what I think is important in any sport, any team. And so I mentioned right before you came on this morning, there's a great scene from what I thought was a classic movie that none of all these young friends have seen, from The Untouchables, where Sean. Oh, you can play it now, Judy. Go ahead.
Well, if you're afraid of getting a rotten apple, don't go to the barrel. Get it off the tree.
That's when Al Capone is controlling Chicago during Prohibition, right? And they don't trust any cops. Like, that conversation starts with Sean Connery saying to Elliot Ness, played by Costner, who I know Randy Shane can't stand, how do you trust anyone? Or who do you trust, I think he says. So now, Judy, if you could show him Udonis's quote that Adena played last week when he spoke in Miami, where he says, they were terrible people before they put those badges on. So I'm wondering, for someone as learned as yourself, how much is it a problem of who these people are before they even get to the force? And then what's that culture like, including the stuff with the unions, that is either enhancing it to make it worse, or is even converting people that really aren't so bad to begin with?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think one place to look at for answering this question, right, on is this bad apples or is this bad trees, right, is why doesn't this problem get fixed by diversifying police forces, right? That is, over time, we've seen more Black police officers police Black communities, but yet we still find ourselves having these conversations. In fact, here in Atlanta, the protests led to 2 college students being tased and pulled out of their cars. And Mayor Keisha Lansbottom comes in and, pulls these guys off the force the next day, right? They're fired. The Fulton County DA comes in the following day and charges them, right? The 2 police officers in this instance were Black. One had been on the force for 16 years. One had been on the force for 20 years, right? And so the idea is that, it's the people, right? Like nobody is out here going to make the case that these 2 Black men were racist and targeting their own people in this kind of vein that we think about of what these bad apples could potentially be doing, right? And what I think that unveils is that these problems are systemic, right? That putting Black faces in high places don't fix things, because the job description in and of itself entails people to do this type of work, right? Nicole Siegel writes a book called, Violence Work. And, and she says that being a police officer is violent work, right? And so the idea that, you put a Black person in this position and it doesn't necessarily get better, and that's not saying that all of them don't get better, right?
Of course.
Before we load up your mentions, but, there are good apples, right. But I think, it's important to look at those moments and show that part of why it's not getting better is because of what policies are in place that protect these certain actions. And for what it's worth, police officers typically know that they're protected, right? Written into their description is to make sure they come home every night, right? Regardless of what that entails. And, and rightfully so, right? We want police officers to come home every night. We also want to come home every night, right? And, and I think kind of this idea that they're protected under this guise that if you're afraid for your life, it's just something that just can't be measured, right? And that's where, it's important to have certain language around policy, that it's important not to just ban something like a chokehold, but to make illegal something like a chokehold, right? A chokehold ban's not enough, right? Chokehold bans were in place when Eric Garner got killed, and it still took 9 months for them to fire him, right? And so, it's important in how these policies are shaped and how these policies are worded if we're going to, try to get at the root to the tree that is growing these bad apples.
This, just Twitter the last week is enough to see what looked to my eyes like thousands of crimes, right? Like rubber bullets shot at people, or just baton, and just unarmed protester standing there peacefully, just getting wailed on by someone who's paid with our tax dollars. Is anybody like I feel like I never even hear anybody wondering if the officers in those videos are going to get in trouble. Like, is there any mechanism of oversight here? Like,
well, I mean, you know, we did see in Buffalo with the instance of the older guy that gets pushed down. And I will say a lot of the headlines that came out of that were pretty misleading because there were a number of police officers from that unit that resigned their positions, but they resigned their positions on the
task force.
Right. Like it wasn't that they resigned from the police force, right? But, you know, a lot of the, like, we know how news stories work, right? You read the headlines, right? Like most people out there are reading headlines and then, oh my God, you see, this is what you need to do, as if they, you know, turned in their badges. That's not what they did, right? But it was still kind of, you know, one of those moments where I think you see people realize, like, you know, these guys probably aren't going to get in trouble, right? I think that the two officers in that instance got suspended, you know, but neither got fired, neither got charged, and more than likely neither will get fired or charged, right? Because there's part of the argument that, you know, did this guy slip on his own, and did they just kind of, you know, like what led to kind of, you know, and you know, we laugh, right? Because we're just like, people come up with the craziest defenses, right? Like people just, you know, are looking for you know, the reason. I think, you know, with the initial autopsy results of George Floyd, right, that this guy died from some underlying conditions, you know, and trying to excuse the knee to the neck for, you know, 8 minutes and 46 seconds, right? As if those underlying conditions were going to take him out in that moment, right? Like he was going to no longer.
What a coincidence.
Because of, right, like those underlying conditions were set to impact him at that time. And it was like, no, like it was the knee, like there, you know, and the independent autopsy comes out later, and it's just like, yeah, it was, right? You know, but again, I think, you know, police accountability is definitely one of the angles. But, you know, I think in the bigger fight against, you know, whether we're thinking about police reform or whether we're thinking about conversations around defunding and divestment, I do think we find ourselves having to be in a situation that before the next George Floyd happens, which naturally is going to happen within our lifetime, right? You know, we have to be in a position where we're in a better place to police the police in a way that they are held more accountable. And that's why we have to be, you know, on and keeping pressure on, you know, policymakers to employ the right language, right? That protects them legally, you know, to enforce these things, right? A ban isn't enough, right? We've seen bans on the books since the 90s. You know, and probably in some places earlier than that. But in New York City, I know that, you know, ban of chokeholds were on the books like since '93 or something. And, you know, that didn't stop Eric Garner from losing his life due to a chokehold, right?
What would you call it, Carl? If is defund the police the best messaging we can use? Because it doesn't seem so accurate that you're really asking for that.
That's right, right. And some people are turned away by the language, right? Like,
that's why messaging is so important. And
so I think, you know, potentially defund the police, refund social services, right? You know, and thinking of just sort of something that can be, you know, cliche to get people on board. Because, you know, when you sit down and have conversations with people, you know, like myself, who believe, you know, who aspire to live in a world that is just police free, right? You realize that what we're thinking is that we're not in a place right now where we don't need the police, right? But we want to imagine a world in which we don't. And so if you imagine the world in which you don't, how do you get there? And you get there by correcting these underlying conditions that have been reinforced time and time again by racist policies in our country, right? And be it inadequate healthcare, you know, lack of employment opportunities, lack of educational resources. And defunding the police is a mechanism that allows us to refund these spaces, right? That can put people in better conditions, in better situations, where they're not turning to whatever acts that, you know, are ultimately calling for police to be used.
We should bring on Gerard. Gerard traditionally comes on at the end of the show and makes the show way better than when we ask the questions. And but you also have noticed today you're like a total provocateur in the group chat there.
I'm just out here starting stuff, lighting fires everywhere I go. Well, listen, like, I mean, Adena, we got to burn this thing down, right? I mean, that's how that's how we fix it.
Yes.
Carl, first of all, thank you. Love it. This conversation's so good. We need more of this. How much of your work delves into the propaganda of what is told in stories about police, right? Like, and look, I want to be very clear again, because I don't want this to get aggregating people to be like, he doesn't think. I know police jobs are dangerous. However, the idea that every day your life was on the line is not exactly true, right? Like, you have a higher chance of dying if you're a firefighter, right? If you are a fisher, guys who like bring in salmon up those people die at a much higher frequency than police do. Like, let's just be real. But we have this mechanism, the local news, whatever, that creates, every night, like, there's people with machine guns running around the streets, like, shooting it. I'm like, where is this mythical neighborhood that happens? Because I don't know where it is. I haven't seen it. Like, where in America is this happening?
Yeah, no, I mean, you're right? Like, the over exaggeration of this kind of rhetoric around police is drives so many people's ideas that we need them in the way that we do. And something that I talk a lot about in the book is that, this is partly because of how we measure crime, right? Like, I make the argument in the book that crime is immeasurable, right? Like, there's actually no way that we can measure crime. All we can measure are arrests. All we can measure are incarceration rates, neither of which actually indicate that a crime actually occurred, right? Because police arrest people, right, who haven't committed crime, and most people are in prison because they accepted plea deals because of lack of a solid defense, mechanism to keep people out of prison, right? And so what we see are arrest rates going up or down, right, in some instances, and then we see incarceration rates going up or down, right? But neither of those are actually indicators on if a crime happens. And it speaks to, how the media kind of jumps on crime and thinking about crime wave and creating hysteria that we need the police in these kind of positions because crime is such a problem, as if that's actually something that we can measure.
One little moment that really struck me really fast was I know I'm bringing a lot Dr. Rashawn Ray's work, but he mentioned this one little thing, which is they have virtual reality simulations, right, and all these different settings, and they will watch it afterward with the police officers who go through it. And they're like, hey, why did you touch your gun when you approached the car that you pulled over for running a stop sign? And the officer's like, I didn't touch my gun. And they're like, they watch it. And I do think like I totally hear you, what you just said, Rod, and agree with you. But I think the reality of how these things go awry does involve fear, right? Like we need to get less scared. But I think like these officers are jacking everyone up by like using touching the gun for a regular traffic stop, and they don't even know they're doing it. But I don't think they're doing it because they're feeling comfortable, right? If you know what I mean. Like
they're watching all these crazy TV shows that Rob was talking about, movies.
Yeah. People are like Brad talking about police anxiety disorder. Like
it's all there though, right? Because if you keep giving, like, you're giving people machine weaponry. Like, what are they gonna? They're not gonna just be like, oh, let me have this cool thing here. They're gonna use it. But like when we talk about defunding police and something that you mentioned, Carl, like the language, and Coach, you said it too, might be a little bit off. We got to be careful, right? Because defunding police doesn't mean tomorrow you wake up, we have no cops. Like, that's not what it is. Like, we still need someone to investigate murder, and like that still has to happen. But something simple we did here in New York, they used to give cops who would write out, parking tickets and traffic violations guns. Well, why do they need guns if you're getting a traffic ticket? Like, so they stopped that, and it's the auxiliary force now. It's
they get that little tiny car.
Yeah, like what do they need an actual machine gun for? Nothing. I'm writing you a ticket for speeding or whatever. Cool. Let's keep it moving. But and then also the idea of refunding social programs. We got to be careful with that too, because there's a segment of the population that when they hear social programs, you know exactly who they think it's going for, right? And I don't got to say exactly what that is. Y'all know what I'm saying.
Liberals? You mean liberals? Is that what you're talking about? But wait, Carl, what does your dad think about this? Like, he doesn't like this defund language, I wouldn't think, right?
No, he actually does. Like, it's funny.
Okay.
So my dad's a career military, and then my uncle is career NYPD. Adena knows this. And we're in a group chat, and, every day we check in because, they're checking on me because they're just like, so how many protests have you gone to today? And how many interviews do you plan on doing? What's your hate mail looking like? Do you need any security services? All of this. But both of them, including my uncle, right, who, retired NYPD, he spent the last 15 years or so on SWAT in New York City.
Oh, wow.
It's just like, yeah, no, it's an effed up system, man. Like, and like, he knows it, he recognizes the problems, and, but I will say, I think the difference between them and me is they have a lot more faith that, reform is an option still, right? That we don't have to blow this thing up, right? That there are ways to correct this from within, that they hold on to for whatever reason, be it personal experience, and and they know just how important it was for them to be in these positions, or we also have to understand that these opportunities have provided jobs for Black communities, in ways that has been huge for Black social mobility in various cities. I forgot. I was recently talking to a buddy, who was involved with the Close Rikers campaign. And, when we think about closing down Rikers, we think, yes, we need to get rid of this hellhole, but we also need to consider what then happens to, something like 70% of its staff, which is African-American or, Black or Latino in this instance. And, what happens to their jobs, right? And for so many of them, like, it's access to middle class, and it's, they're solid jobs that allow for their kids to go off to college, right? Shout out Adena, right? Like, Adena's father, police officer, and, Adena's now, fighting the power, right? Like, and it's the same thing with me, right? And, but I tell people all the time, like, my dad did 23 years in the Army, and now he's wrapping up his 15th year as a high school ROTC instructor. He has never been out of the uniform at this point. When I was graduating from high school, my grandfather was in the Army. He was in the Army. I was like, I'm going into the Army. And my dad was like, the hell you are. He said, like, he was just like, I gave this country 23 years of my life, so you wouldn't have to give it a day. And his idea was
doesn't sound very ROTC to me.
No. and what's funny is, like, my dad, in Delaware, up until recently, because my dad is a high school ROTC instructor in Delaware, up until recently, he would actually advise his students to go National Guard route, because the National Guard was 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year, and would pay for your college, right? Like, so he always kind of was like, this is a step forward, right? And for him, he would pitch it to his kids, his students in particular, as use the Army as a job, not a career, right? In same ways that I think it's important for us to actually advise kids about thinking about sports, right? Because even if you have a career in sports, right, you're what, in your 30s when you retire? What are you going to do for the rest of your life, right? Like, and so, this is sort of a short-term, temporary kind of position. And that's something that my dad had always kind of, like, used in terms of pitching it to students who still needed it, right? He saw me as somebody who didn't need it. You got this scholarship, go off to college. And then, when I was headed to get a PhD, like, it was over, right? Like, my dad was just like, oh yeah, we got a doctor in the family, and I'm a junior, right? But I just never used junior on my name. And so he takes credit for a lot of the books, articles, circles, and he's just like, yeah, if you do a group research, you don't know if you're going to return me or him, like, and he loves all of that. But I think it's interesting to have conversations with, folks like that who have been career military, who have been career officers, and realize that they too are super critical of the current state of our systems, in ways that, folks need to realize, and take very seriously their experiences, because, the solutions might be in their minds in ways that, people are looking for outside.
Well, that's encouraging. Okay, thank you so much. We used all of our time, but Adena, thank you, David, Gerard, Dr. Suddler, thank you, everybody.
Salmon fisherman.